Start the recording. So I think let's kick off, and whoever is joining us a little bit later, that's totally fine as well, actually. So I'd like to welcome you all to our webinar today, which is co-hosted by Megan Burns. Thank you very much for joining us, Megan.
You're very welcome.
Cool. So I think we should just kick off, and obviously anyone else who joins us later, just feel free to jump in whenever you want to. So our webinar today is called Countering the Hidden Forces That Hurt Customer Experience Transformation. And as mentioned, it's co-hosted with Megan Burns, who's the founder of Experience Enterprises. So before I let Megan introduce herself and go through her slides on this really interesting subject, I'm just going to really quickly introduce myself so that you know who I am. My name is Aggie, and I'm the Director of Digital Marketing for Thematic. And if you're wondering who Thematic are, we're a customer feedback analysis solution. So we do text analytics for a lot of big enterprises, a lot of global enterprises, and we do that through AI, so through artificial intelligence. And I can give you a little bit of an overview of what we do maybe a little bit later in the presentation, if we have time for that. But for now, I'll let Megan introduce herself. So Megan, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background? And in particular, I was really interested in your experience with Forrester, as that obviously feels really relevant for what we do at Thematic, but also just very interesting experience there. So if you wouldn't mind sharing that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I first became an analyst in customer experience in 2006, and that was when I joined Forrester and the customer experience team. I've been working at it ever since. In the 10 years that I was there, I covered a whole range of different aspects of customer experience, really kind of following along with where the field was at the time. In the early days, there wasn't really a field. I was focused on measurement and ROI back then because we didn't really know what it meant to measure customer experience or manage it as an enterprise concern. There were very few companies doing that. And there were a lot that were skeptical. So we didn't have the kind of data that we have now to say, yes, this is something you should be investing in. As we started to gain traction there, I shifted my focus to answering the question, okay, so if we do invest in this and we want to be more deliberate about customer experience, what does that look like? And so I spent 5 or 6 years, maybe more, researching customer experience management maturity, right? What does it mean to have a mature customer experience program? Led the research on that, and with my team helped launch a maturity model that is still in use by a lot of companies today. And then as that started to gain more traction, what we found was that knowing why to do it and knowing what to do were helpful, but there was still a gap. There was still a hurdle between knowing what to do and believing you should do it and then actually doing it. So that's where I've been focused for the last several years, including the last 2 since I launched my own company, is the change management side of things and helping individuals and companies understand, okay, how do we go from something we know we should do to something we're actually doing consistently, and what can get in the way of that, and how do we move those roadblocks out of the way?
Cool. Thanks for sharing that. That's really, really interesting, actually. So often in my job, I speak to clients who are really struggling with getting their customer experience up to scratch. I think it's very common these days because there's so much focus on customer experience, obviously. So it's getting more competitive. So what we do at Thematic is actually extract the insights from their customer feedback. And obviously listening to customers' feedback is a great start, but then often our clients say that, well, we have all these great initiatives to drive our customer experience and improve our NPS, but nothing is really happening. So what can we do to make it better? Or what can we do to increase our NPS? This is a very common question that we get asked. And I know that basically what we're going to talk about here today as well is that often there are things that we haven't even thought about that can actually have a massive impact for driving customer experience. So yeah, that's what we're going to talk about here today, and hopefully it will be very useful for you. And I was just going to say as well that if anyone has any questions along the way, feel free to just shout out. You can just write them in the chat function of the webinar. And I know that there are a lot of people who will watch this recording. Maybe they're not able to join us live, so feel free to email myself any questions that you might have, and we will share our contact details as well at the end of the webinar. So yeah, the stage is yours, Megan.
Thanks. And yeah, what Aggie was talking about just now, companies where they have a lot of data and not a lot of action, I hear that so much. And it gets even harder when you start to move from having projects that you're launching, customers are complaining about X, so we're going to go fix X, to starting to be more of just the general, how do we think about customer experience and all the other things that we do in the organization. And the real roadblock there, part of the reason why it's so tough is because we can't see it. And it has to do with the brain. People talk all the time about how legacy technology makes it hard to transform customer experience. Well, the brain is the ultimate legacy technology, and it's one that we can't rip out and replace, and we only have limited control over. But one of the features of the brains of all of the people in an organization, all people, is autopilot. And that autopilot feature is actually a huge aspect of change management. We absolutely need it, because if we don't have it, we have to think hard about how to do every single little thing. And most of what people do every day is the same kind of stuff in the same kind of location. So autopilot literally allows us to survive. But when we're trying to act differently, the fact that we don't think about what we're doing makes it impossible for us to change what we're doing. And it's actually, what's interesting is it's not just behaviors, thoughts get automated too. And those automatic thoughts are really at the core of when we talk about culture and changing culture. This is what we're talking about. Because anytime anybody's in a situation and they say, okay, what's going on here and how should I respond? The story they tell themselves about what's going on is usually automatic. It's usually based on some mental shortcut. So if you think about a culture that's really compliance oriented and you're trying to empower employees more, you have to acknowledge the fact that somewhere in that organization, people automatically assume, oh, employees can't be trusted to do the right thing. We need rules and we need to monitor them and we need compliance. And they might not actually even be aware that that's what they think. They may not believe that they think that. It's an example of unconscious bias. But those automations are what really make it hard for people to change and for us as leaders to influence change, because we need something to kind of shake them out of that autopilot and say, okay, let's think about what you're doing. Because awareness is the first step, right? You have to be aware of what you're doing, but not just in general, but in the moment, like when it's actually happening. If someone says something to you and you tend to interpret it as being mean-spirited and it isn't meant that way, you have to catch it in the moment when you go, oh, okay, no, calm down. They're not being mean. And that awareness can be hard to create because we're all moving so fast. We're all so busy. But even when we have awareness, people need alternatives. And this is one of the places where it becomes tough in customer experience, because it's like, okay, I know what I would do and I know what the policy says. But if you're giving me permission to bend the rules to do something, how far can I bend them? What options could I give the customer? So when we're leading change, we also have to help people understand what alternatives are there to what you've been doing or how you've been thinking. And then the last piece is energy. I did a video yesterday on LinkedIn. Yesterday was National Stress Awareness Day. And I talked about, which I didn't even know was a thing until recently. I talked about the fact that when people are stressed out or tired or really busy, even when they know they should do something different and they know what to do, they just don't have the energy. And we've all been in this situation where we're trying to change a habit and we just, when we get tired, we kind of fall back on old habits. So as leaders, it's not just about telling people, here's what you should be do differently. It's helping them have all three of these things in the moment when they're making a decision, when they're talking to a customer, when they're planning a product. And it's hundreds, sometimes thousands of these across all different people in the company. And unfortunately, this stuff, the change, we can't do for people. I talk about customer experiences. It's like eat healthy and exercise, right? When a company says we want to improve customer experience, it's the same as when one of us as an individual says, I want to eat healthier and exercise. Nobody can do it for us. And really doing it is about a lot of little changes compounded together. So as a leader, what we have to think about is the fact that you can't change people, but you can spark change. And so I keep a quote on the wall in my office. It's one of my favorite quotes from Mother Teresa. It says, I alone cannot change the world, but I can cast a stone across the waters to create many ripples. And so when I'm working with companies to plan customer experience change management programs, that's really what we start with is what stones can you cast to help create the ripples that are going to get people to make thinking about customers and customer centricity. Sorry, I keep hitting my microphone. Thinking about customers and customer centricity, part of what is automated as opposed to being something outside the automation. So you had been asking me when we were preparing for the webinar, what are some specific things people can do, right? What are some of those stones? And so let me share with the audience a couple of those. One of the, I won't say easy, but one of the easier ways to shake people off of autopilot is to change your language, change how you talk about your business, change how you talk about your customers, because how we talk about the world actually shapes how we think about the world. And so when you talk differently, you think differently. And I'll give you an example of this from customer experience. I did another video a couple weeks ago. I had a lot of people saying, well, we've created journey maps, but we're not getting people to use them. Like they come to the workshop, we do that first set of projects, like you said, and then people go off and go back to doing what they're doing and they never use the journey maps again. So my suggestion for folks when this happens is that you make a distinction between a customer journey map and a customer journey blueprint. They're both diagrams, they're both visual, they both describe the customer journey. But maps conceptually capture what is, right? We use them to understand the current state. Blueprints represent what should be or what will be. Right. And so there's an inherent assumption when you talk about something as a blueprint that, oh, okay, we're going to use this as we build whatever it is we're building. And so saying that a diagram is a blueprint puts people in a more active frame of reference. And I've seen this work really powerfully. Same piece of paper, just calling it something different. And you can also do this with how you talk about parts of the customer journey or things that you use jargon for. I had a client that was focused on onboarding and trying to improve the onboarding experience. And one of the first things we did was said, okay, well, let's define what the onboarding experience is. And we figured out pretty quickly that clients don't think about being onboarded. This is a B2B technology company, right? There is no defined start and end period. The way the company thought, okay, when we finish sending this last email, that's the end of the onboarding process. Customers weren't thinking about it that way. And I came across this quote. I can't remember where I came across it. So if someone watching this is yours or you know where this came from, please let me know. But it's a fantastic quote. It says, onboarding isn't about teaching customers to use your products. It's helping them figure out how to solve their problems using your products. And so people are not, oops, I went too far. People are not done being onboarded until they feel like, okay, I know how to use this new tool that my company gave me to do the things I need to do. And so that created a shift in how they talked about and thought about what onboarding meant, that had always been there, but nobody had really thought about it that critically until we thought about, well, what do customers call this? And there's a fun little game that I have adapted. If anybody watching or listening has been to a baby shower, you may have played this game. It's called the clothespin game. And it's basically an exercise in awareness. So you can do it at a meeting, you can do it for your team over the course of the day, but when you have a word that you're trying to change or a phrase you're trying to change, like journey maps versus journey blueprints, everybody gets a clothespin to put on their shirt at the beginning of whatever the time frame is. And you're watching for each other to say the no word. And if someone catches you saying it, they get your clothespin. And this goes back and forth. And whoever has the most clothespins on their shirt at the end of the day wins, or at the end of the meeting. And it's silly and goofy, but it takes this idea of, hey, we're trying to change how we think about our business, and makes it non-threatening and lighthearted. But the clothespins are also a visual reminder. And that exercise I found, even after people leave the meeting where we're doing that, it's created enough of an awareness of how often they use these terms that they're trying to change, that it has a ripple effect that happens and lasts after the meeting. And that's really important, because one of the ways that you overcome this autopilot is by enabling self-awareness. And as a customer experience leader, self-awareness is much better than you telling them, hey, did you know that you do this? Because even when people want you to point out things they're doing, it's human nature to just sort of be like, okay, thanks for telling me that I, do something obnoxious that I never thought about. So the more we can help people become self-aware of automatic thought patterns, automatic behaviors, assumptions they make about customers, the more likely they're going to be to change. And I'm a word nerd, so I use a lot of quotes, and this one from Albert Einstein kind of touches on this one. I never teach my pupils. I only attempt to provide the conditions in which they can learn.
That's really
and that's kind of the philosophy. Yeah, that's the philosophy that I encourage my clients to take, because you can't force people to learn. You can just I call it engineering an opportunity for people to have their own epiphanies. And so looking for ways to do that in technology actually really helps. So this is one of the ways that a voice of the customer platform or a customer analytics platform can really help. If you think about fitness trackers don't tell you what to do. They don't tell you to change. They just make you aware of what you're doing. And we can use some of this technology that we have now to understand, okay, well, how often is somebody using a particular word in conversations with customers? How often are they, not using a particular word? And I've seen this happen and be used with like contact center agents, not as any sort of a punishment or quality management, but just to say, hey, we know that customers respond better to these words than these. We're going to give you some data, just like the Apple just added the screen time feature to the phone that tells you once a week, here's the average amount of screen time you spent. It's akin to that, but for employees and how they're talking in their language. And that can really help. You can also do a time tracking study or a habit tracking study. There was one in HBR earlier this year that I really liked. It was data from 27 CEOs about how they spend their time over 3 months. And it was interesting to read how the CEOs responded to getting this data about how they were spending their time, right? Nobody was super surprised to find out that they spent 55% of their time with their direct reports and other senior managers, right? That's kind of what CEOs do. But it started to make more sense when they were thinking about, okay, we're trying to drive change, and sometimes the middle management doesn't come along as quickly. Well, they're not seeing you as much. So they may not realize or quite believe that you are as behind this change as you are. And then the most interesting piece of it was the fact that on average, these CEOs spent 3% of their time with customers. And in the article, it talked about the fact that most of them were shocked, and not in a good way. Because if you ask these people, are you customer centric? They would say absolutely.
Yeah.
But the fact that their behavior doesn't match their beliefs was not something that they were even aware of. So just making them aware of it in this short-term study catalyzed them to say, okay, I need to find a way to spend more time with customers. And interestingly, the ones that are successful at doing that are the ones who use this autopilot feature of our brain to their advantage. They find ways to work with existing routines and build habits like visiting customers into their everyday. One person meets with one customer face-to-face every single day. It's just part of his day. One builds 2 days a month that are for customer visits. And every month there's 2 days. One of them packages customer visits with every time they travel. So the more we can help people work with the momentum of their existing routines, the more likely we are to get these new things to become part of autopilot. And that's tough because it requires us to understand a lot about how they do their jobs. The visual that comes to mind when I think about this is the old jump rope game. I don't know if you ever played Double Dutch.
Yeah, I did.
I was always terrified of it. Still am. But it's a great metaphor because if you've got product managers or technology managers in your organization, security people, their ropes are not going to stop spinning. They're still doing their jobs and they need to keep doing their jobs. Our job as a customer experience professional is to figure out what's that timing and understand just the right time to jump in so that we can join in with their pace and just become part of that routine. And that's not necessarily how people think of it sometimes. They think, oh, we're going to create this new process for customer experience management or customer experience impact assessment. And then we wonder why people don't do it, because they're flying ahead on autopilot and that's not in their line of sight. So they don't do it. And we're seeing this show up in a lot of ways, like more companies are not creating separate steering committees for customer experience. They're taking, like, reviewing voice of the customer data and looking at what projects are we going to launch. They're integrating that into steering committees and planning committees that already exist because there's already momentum. There's already somebody whose job it is to schedule those meetings and those discussions. And so it's a lot easier to add something to a meeting people already are already used to going to than it is to try to get them to see something completely different. And so when we talk all the time about wanting people to use customer feedback, part of what we have to do is say, okay, how do we put it in front of them at the right moment? I had a client that did a really good job with this. We were doing a journey mapping workshop, and they had one of the people from their voice of the customer team come to the workshop. And her primary role there was to give the teams that were mapping the customer journey real life data about, well, here's what customers did. Here's the things they complained about. You're wondering how they're feeling in this part of the journey? Well, let me tell you, here's what the VOC program says. And that data had always been there, but people hadn't stepped aside to look at it. And by kind of putting it in a place where not only could they not avoid it, but it had some context and some meaning, that data was stickier. And just the idea that there was data that they could consult when they were having these sort of theoretical conversations about customers, that changed people's pattern of when they're doing other things. Now they're much more likely to say, you know, hey, let's call Mary. I don't think that was her name, but, you know, let's call Mary because she might have some data on this. So things like that are really helpful in shaking people out of this autopilot. And the last thing that I'll mention is not something we typically talk about in customer experience, but I alluded to it earlier, reducing stress. Because autopilot takes over when we're stressed and when we're tired. And so even when we have been practicing something new and shaking out of it, if our stress levels ratchet up, which is always going to happen, we're more likely to fall back to the old habits. And so customer experience programs really ought to think about things they can do to reduce stress as a means of facilitating change. And stress comes from a lot of places. In business, we're kind of sleep deprived. And in some companies, it's become like a badge of honor to see, who can work the craziest hours. Yeah. As part of empathy and customer experience management, starting to say, you know what, that's not cool. And I found a quote on the Thrive Global website, which is Arianna Huffington's website, that talked about this from the CMO of JP Morgan Chase. And I love this quote. She said, when I look back on mistakes I've made, hiring the wrong person, approving something that needed more work, or snapping at someone who didn't deserve it, they all have one thing in common. I was tired.
Yeah.
And that's an example of snapping out of autopilot in so many ways. Number one, just recognizing that when you're tired, this is how you respond instead of the way you want to respond. But also being able to admit and acknowledge that, yeah, when I'm tired and stressed out, I do things that maybe aren't as customer centric as I really believe that I am. And it's not like suddenly people become unempathetic, but their capacity for empathy goes down because they're stressed. And I love this quote in particular that it came from, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, sorry, I think that's just the connection. Sorry to interrupt you. I thought that was really interesting. I just thought, do you think that can also have something to do with, say, company culture then? So if we were to sort of shift or transition to change the company culture into something obviously a little bit more healthy, as we see in a lot of countries, say maybe the Scandinavian countries, where they have discussions of having, 4-day weeks or 6-hour working days and things like that, which is actually, I'm not sure if they've actually gone through with it, but I know it's passed through some sort of legislation, which is really interesting. So is that something you think might obviously change that or be able to change that in the long term?
Absolutely. And part of the, people who write about that kind of culture change talk about the fact that it's a similar problem. People sort of objectively know it's probably a good idea, but don't do it. And it's partly because we're so used to that social pattern of when somebody says, oh, I was on 3 airplanes in a row and I did that. We have an automatic thought that says, oh, this person is really committed to the organization, or, oh, that's the kind of thing that gets rewarded. And so it's this unconscious reinforcement. And if we can snap ourselves out of that and start bragging or start rewarding the fact that somebody went to bed early and got a really good night's sleep because they had a big meeting in the morning. Or like, I don't fly out the morning of a presentation anymore. I always fly the day before to make sure that I'm well rested because it's a better customer experience for people. So this same unconscious automatic behavior and thoughts is part of stress management as much as it is part of sort of the process of getting work done. Yeah. So yeah, that was a great question. And for executives in particular, I think it's really important because you don't necessarily always realize how much what you say can be automatically interpreted by other people in ways you didn't intend. There's a very funny and sort of tragic at the same time story of a CEO who made an offhand comment that, oh, hey, we don't have any blueberry muffins at this meeting. And it wasn't a big deal, but people who worked for him interpreted it as, oh my God, he only likes blueberry muffins. We have to make sure there are blueberry muffins at every meeting. And it turned into kind of like the green M&M thing in the contract for bands. And every single meeting had like only blueberry muffins for the next 2 years. And when the CEO finally found out about it, he was like, what? That wasn't what I meant. I wasn't like being a diva or having an edict. I was just like, oh, blueberry muffins are usually popular. It's weird that there aren't any here.
Yeah.
And so that was a moment of self-awareness for him of how these automatic interpretations of something he says can absolutely snowball and create stress, and he might not even be aware of it. So another way that we're seeing people manage this, and this is also related to customer experience, is with email. Because there have been some pretty solid case studies that say that taking time off from work email, and you mentioned some of the legislation, taking time off from work email usually does not hurt customer satisfaction, and it improves the person's productivity. So using something like an email scheduler, this happens to be one that I use, gives you the freedom to work on email at 11 o'clock at night if you want. You can send it, but the other person won't get it at 8 o'clock in the morning, won't get it until 8 o'clock in the morning. So they're not going to have the automatic thought that says, oh, my boss is emailing me at 11 o'clock at night. They expect me to respond. That means I have to be always on. And that spiral doesn't happen. And it helps set healthier boundaries between bosses and employees and between companies and customers. And so we strike a better balance of how do we make sure that we help, we're appropriately available to customers, but not so much that we drive our employees into the ground. And that's one of the tougher balances to strike in today's environment. So I know these are really small things, but that's kind of the reality of when you get to this level of change management beyond defining the processes and knowing what to do. There isn't like one big whiz-bang solution. There's a last quote from Vincent van Gogh that says, great things are done by a series of small things brought together. And, he showed that in his art as well, using pointillism and little dots to make a bigger picture. And so when we think about, all right, how do we get past this sort of invisible wall of change, which exists with customer experience and with other things, it really is by just consistently finding and keeping up with a lot of these little things and little habit changes that ultimately lead and snowball to a bigger change. Because when you read a case study, is one of the problems I think with case studies, it seems like it was a foregone conclusion that would happen, and it's all wrapped up in a nice little bow. I've been inside many of these case studies as they're happening. That's not how it actually happens, right? You don't become an overnight success overnight. It actually is like 15 years. So the more we remind ourselves of that, I think the better able we are to adapt our transformation strategies to the reality of how change actually happens.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. I particularly like just these examples that you've mentioned, just the fact that they are small changes, but they make a big difference, I think. And especially we all know that, there's this, I guess, trend, if you want to call it that, to shift towards a more positive company culture. And I think it's something that a lot of companies are striving for. And I talk to businesses a lot that definitely that's their goal, to be customer centric or whatever you want to call it, but often don't realize and I don't want to say enormity, but how big a shift is actually needed. And it's kind of a holistic shift, right? It needs to be something that not only sits with the CEO, obviously, but everyone has to buy into it. And it all consists of these little things that you've just mentioned. It's just from the emails coming at 11 o'clock at night, which is not good for anyone, I think. I guess if you want to be productive, you can be very productive in a certain amount of time, or just, like you say, just shift it towards so that the email comes in the morning instead. And I think that's really, really interesting. So thank you for giving us like a different perspective on these things.
Oh, you're welcome.
Cool.
I think we have time to take some questions. Do we? Do we not?
Yeah, we definitely do. And if people do want to just send a question in the chat, then you're very welcome. If you don't have a question at the moment, then I definitely have a little sneaky question lined up for Megan, which I've prepared earlier. So I just wanted to know, actually, because I know that a lot of CEOs are struggling at the moment. If there would be one thing, what advice would you give to customer experience leaders that are kind of hitting the wall at the moment and maybe bumping against these invisible barriers at the moment? Maybe they realize it, maybe they don't, but what advice would you give?
The number one piece of advice I give people is make what you're already doing more visible. Because human beings need proof. We need social proof that what you're telling me is okay now actually is okay. And being told that doesn't have the same impact as seeing it happen and seeing it be praised, or seeing the fact that nothing bad happens when you do that. And so there are a lot of situations, especially with executive support, where executives are doing this all the time, but the rest of the company just doesn't see it. And so the problem isn't a lack of support, the problem is a lack of social proof and visibility into that support. So before you even worry about doing something else, just try making what you're already doing more visible to a broader swath of the organization.
Right, that's really interesting. So one of the things actually that tie into that a little bit is what we do at Thematic and how we obviously do customer feedback analysis, but a big thing of what we do, or a big part of what we do, is sharing the feedback across the organization. So that's something that, and I just think it is relevant with what you're saying, in that with the tool, which is a dashboard, you can literally share it with everyone. It's in a digestible format, and you can report on that super easily. So it doesn't become this sort of boring PowerPoint presentation, which we kind of all cringe at, but it just is a little bit more digestible, and you can get visualizations of your main insights. And I think that's very interesting as well. And in relation to this, is that just the sharing of the insights, and like you said, it's not the CEO kind of just holding on to this. It's just trying to share what they know and making everyone a little bit more involved. And I think that gives a lot of purpose to people's jobs as well, because I think that's another important thing in the company culture, and towards striving towards a positive company culture, is just kind of feeling that you have a sense of purpose and you're doing a good job. And in my experiences of working, whenever the CEOs or my managers have just been really open about where the company is, where we're going, what we're striving for, that's something that gives, a lot of purpose and motivation as well. And I think that adds to a very positive culture. So yeah, that's definitely something I agree with.
Yeah, and customer feedback is actually one of the best places to think about some of these small repeatable habits, because you're getting it constantly. So having some sort of a routine of taking a particular quote or a particular interesting data point from your customer feedback analysis and just making it a habit to share it every day, it's not automatic for humans to see the world from somebody else's perspective. We see it from our perspective. So having that daily reminder of here's how the customer sees the world, that's actually a fantastic example of something you can do to help people make these changes part of their normal routine. So stuff like what you guys do at Thematic is a huge piece of this puzzle.
Right, cool. Thanks for that. I think, well, we're kind of out of time, but I want to share your contact details so that everyone knows if they are interested in learning more, or if you want to get pick Megan's head a little bit, pick Megan's brain on her expertise, then this is how you can contact her, and my contact details are there as well. If you have any questions, definitely feel free to drop some questions in the chat if you have any right now. Any burning questions that you might have, we'll be super happy to respond, or just email either of us later on. And obviously, if you're interested in Thematic, you can just go to our website, which is getthematic.com, and Megan's website, experienceenterprises.com, is there as well. So yeah, I think we can wrap it up, unless you have anything else, Megan, that you'd like to share. Cool.
Nope. that was it.
Okay, so that was short and sweet, but I think very, very insightful, and I've definitely learned a lot. Yeah, I'll be watching out for Megan's work for sure. And yeah, thank you guys for joining us, and to all of you who are watching the recording, thanks as well, and feel free to contact us if you have any questions. So yeah, thank you all. Thanks, Megan.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for having me, and thanks to everybody watching, whether it's live or remotely. I hope this was something that's going to help you in your jobs.
I'm sure it is. I'm sure it's definitely helping me. That's for sure. So very, very interesting. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. See you guys.